There are exactly 3 qualities that avoidant people consistently find themselves drawn toward. And I want to be upfront with you. I understand this from the inside because I lean avoidant myself. Every single one of these 3 things has pulled me in at some point in my own life. Hi, I'm Anne and welcome back. Let's start with the first one, something I like to call the point of no return. I'll admit right away that this first idea feels less like a personality trait and more like a hidden threshold. And yet, in a strange way, it might end up being the single most important factor of the 3. Avoidant people are not one uniform group. Picture attachment styles laid out across a long line. On one far end, you have people who lean heavily anxious. Right in the middle sits what most of us would call the secure sweet spot. And on the opposite end, you find people with strong avoidant patterns. But here's the part most people never stop to consider. Avoidants do not all behave the same way. Some are only mildly guarded, keeping others at a slight arm's length. Others react to closeness almost the way you would react to standing beside a burning building. That is why it helps to think of avoidant behavior in layers rather than one single label. The mildest layer sits so close to secure attachment that calling it avoidant almost feels unfair. The next layer up is warm, friendly, easy to enjoy time with, but consistently sidesteps any real emotional depth. After that comes the classic push and pull pattern, affectionate one moment, distant the next. Beyond that is something closer to emotional shutdown, where expression goes flat and any sense of connection seems to disappear entirely. And at the far end sits full-blown crisis mode, cutting off contact completely, sabotaging plans, actively dismantling a relationship the moment it starts to feel genuinely good. What almost nobody talks about is that people do not stay locked in one layer forever. Stress and pressure push someone further into shutdown, and only real safety combined with genuine self-awareness can pull them back the other way. Whichever layer someone is occupying in a given moment changes everything about how reachable they actually are. That brings us to the idea of the point of no return. Think of an old story about a general who once stood at the edge of a river with his army, facing a decision that would reshape everything that came after. Law strictly forbade him from marching his troops across that river into new territory. Crossing was not just symbolic. It meant openly defying his own government and starting a war there was no walking back from. Staying on his side of the river meant he kept his position and his safety intact. Crossing meant there was no undoing it. It was a genuine all-or-nothing moment, which is exactly why history still points back to it as the definitive line that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The same logic applies to avoidant people. Once someone crosses deep enough into emotional shutdown, there is no simple, easy path back toward connection. And that threshold tends to line up almost exactly with the push and pull layer described earlier. Cross past that point, and you are typically looking at someone who has, at least for now, closed the door. Take someone sitting deep in shutdown or full crisis mode. It is not that they are fundamentally unable to love. It is that they have entered a psychological space where love simply cannot land right now. No matter how hard you try, they have already crossed a line, and once someone is on that far side, nothing you do matters. Not your charm, not your kindness, not the perfect message sent at the perfect time. Not until something shifts for them internally first. I know this might feel like an unexpected place to start a conversation supposedly about what draws avoidant people toward you, but here's what most people miss. How activated or overwhelmed someone currently is often determines whether they are even capable of receiving love at all in that moment. That is exactly why I count this as the first major factor. It is not really about something you actively do, it is about where they currently stand emotionally. If your avoidant partner is still on the near side of that threshold, there is genuine room for connection to develop. They might hesitate, retreat occasionally, or run through that familiar push and pull pattern, but love still has a way of reaching them. If they have already crossed further into shutdown, though, they are operating from pure defense. It is not that your feelings for them go unnoticed. It is that they physically cannot allow themselves to feel anything back right now. And until they find their own way back across that line, which realistically can take a long time, nothing you bring to the table is going to break through. This actually explains a pattern you have probably noticed if you have spent any time reading comment sections on this topic. The same handful of reactions repeat constantly. Comments insisting avoidants are hopeless, that they are fundamentally incapable of real love, that you should never waste your time because they will never change. What is interesting, once you understand this layered picture, is that the people writing those comments are almost never describing the milder end of the spectrum. The milder layers, while they carry their own struggles with intimacy, are still generally capable of forming real connections, even if it takes longer to open up or they retreat under pressure sometimes. No, the people posting those bitter, defeated comments are almost always describing something much darker: the aftermath, the wreckage left behind after encountering full emotional shutdown. That is a fundamentally different experience, marked by disappearing without explanation, complete emotional stonewalling, and relationships that get sabotaged the moment they start feeling genuinely good. It is no wonder people walk away from that convinced avoidants as a whole are simply broken or unreachable, even though that conclusion does not hold up once you understand the fuller picture. Now let's move into the second major trait. Avoidant people are consistently, almost magnetically drawn toward partners who feel somewhat emotionally unavailable. If this pattern does not surprise you, it is worth unpacking more thoroughly here, because this is not just a casual observation or a pop psychology talking point. It traces back to genuine early developmental experiences. Here is how it typically forms. From early childhood, often well before conscious memory even kicks in, avoidant people learn a very specific and often painful lesson: that safety is found in distance rather than in closeness. This usually happens in homes where emotional needs went unmet, where caregivers were inconsistent, dismissive, intrusive, or simply unavailable in ways that taught the developing child not to rely on connection as a source of comfort. As a result, emotional intimacy never got wired into their nervous system as something soothing. Instead, closeness itself became linked with danger, carrying the implicit threat of suffocating pressure or of eventual rejection once someone got close enough to really see them. That is a heavy pattern to carry, and most avoidant people are not even consciously aware it is running quietly in the background of their adult relationships. As a direct result of this early conditioning, the avoidant nervous system essentially becomes wired to actively seek out space rather than closeness. Space feels regulating. Space feels controllable. Space feels like safety in a way that closeness simply never learned to feel. This is precisely why partners who are not fully emotionally accessible, people who are somewhat busy, somewhat guarded, somewhat hard to fully pin down, hit a strange, almost paradoxical sweet spot for avoidant people. Logically, you would think someone who struggles with closeness would be drawn toward the most available, most emotionally open partner possible. But the opposite tends to be true, precisely because full availability triggers the exact fear response their nervous system was trained to avoid. There is a genuinely compelling way of thinking about this that experts in the field have pointed to, and it helps explain the broader push and pull dynamic that tends to develop whenever an anxious person and an avoidant person end up together, each one unconsciously reinforcing the other's deepest fears. Have you ever noticed how people with anxious or avoidant attachment styles react when they finally land in a relationship with someone genuinely secure and steady? What tends to happen is surprising. When a calm, steady person shows up, especially if you lean anxious or grew up in a chaotic household, that calm can start to feel boring. You might catch yourself thinking, where is the intensity? Where is the spark? Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely counterintuitive. Most of us are raised to believe that calm, steady behavior is the ultimate green flag in a relationship. We are taught to look for people who are predictable, emotionally regulated, easy to be around. And for someone with a securely attached nervous system, that is exactly right. Calm reads as safety, plain and simple. But for someone whose nervous system was shaped early on by chaos or unpredictability, that same calm can register very differently. Instead of feeling soothing, it can actually feel foreign, even faintly unsettling, almost like waiting for something to go wrong simply because nothing has yet. When you have spent years, sometimes decades, wired to associate connection with tension, genuine calm can trigger a kind of internal alarm rather than relief. Distance, on the other hand, feels like familiar territory, an emotional landscape they know how to navigate instinctively, even if it is not particularly healthy for them. So here's what happens in practice when an avoidant partner senses you are not fully locked in on them at every single moment. Maybe your schedule is genuinely full. Maybe your attention is legitimately split across other priorities in your life. Maybe your entire world simply does not orbit around their existence. That gap, that bit of breathing room, does not push them away the way you would logically expect. Counterintuitively, it does the opposite. It puts them at ease. It lowers their guard rather than raising it. Now, here is where I think most people badly misunderstand the underlying mechanic, and it is worth being really precise about this, because getting it wrong can backfire badly. This has absolutely nothing to do with playing manipulative games or manufacturing artificial distance to seem more desirable. Avoidant people, in my experience, are remarkably perceptive when it comes to sensing when someone is deliberately withholding attention as a calculated tactic. That kind of performative distance rarely works and often backfires by reading as manipulative or simply confusing. It does not create genuine ease, it creates suspicion. What actually produces this calming effect is not a strategy you deploy, it is having a genuinely full, rich, engaging life of your own. One so naturally full that you are not artificially centering another person in it, not because you are trying to seem unavailable, but because you actually have your own passions, friendships, goals, and rhythms that exist independently of the relationship. That authenticity is what avoidant people respond to, because it cannot be faked convincingly over time, and it reads as real rather than strategic. Right out of the gate, before anything else can happen, warmth matters enormously. Steady, genuine attentiveness, someone actually paying attention rather than just going through the motions, is what signals on a deep and mostly unconscious level that it is actually safe to let someone in. Most avoidant people gravitate toward a partner who notices the small stuff, the details most people overlook entirely, someone who listens without immediately jumping to judgment or trying to fix everything, someone who has a way of smoothing over rough edges instead of sharpening them further. That kind of warmth starts melting the very first layer of defense, the outermost wall that keeps almost everyone at arm's length. But then, almost predictably, things take an ironic turn. The moment those initial walls start coming down, the moment the guard drops even slightly, something strange happens. If that warmth does not stay calibrated, if it morphs into constant, non-stop closeness with no room to breathe, panic sets in fast. It starts to feel less like connection and more like a trap slowly closing in, and the instinct is to bolt. This is exactly where space becomes not just helpful, but essential. The partner who instinctively senses when to lean in and when to pull back, who reads the room without needing to be told, is the one who actually manages to get through over time. This is not about sending confusing or mixed signals, and it is definitely not about playing games. It is about establishing a genuine rhythm, a back-and-forth cadence that mirrors how trust naturally builds. Warmth communicates that you care, that they matter to you. Space communicates that they still have their own freedom, their own autonomy, that they have not lost themselves in this. Combined together, those two things strike a balance that lets an avoidant person breathe easy while still staying emotionally connected. Think of it like fire. Too little heat, and you are left out in the cold, disconnected and unmoved. Too much heat applied too fast or too constantly, and it burns, scares someone off entirely. But when that warmth is calibrated just right, dosed out with intention and awareness, it works the way a flame draws in a moth. There is a pull toward it, almost against instinct, even while part of that same instinct is genuinely afraid of getting scorched in the process. That tension, Wanting closeness while fearing its consequences is precisely what keeps an avoidant person engaged rather than shutting down completely. Now let's move into the second paradox: generosity paired with boundaries. I will be honest and just own this outright. Avoidant people, myself very much included, can be pretty self-absorbed at times. We retreat into our own private worlds, get consumed by our projects and our routines, because routines feel controllable, predictable, safe. And yet, quietly, beneath all of that self-protection, there is still a craving for a partner who is generous enough to reach across that gap. Someone willing to initiate, to remind us that real connection still exists on the other side of our walls, even when we are not actively seeking it out ourselves. But there is always a catch. If that generosity comes without any boundaries attached, if someone gives and gives endlessly with nothing held back for themselves, two things start happening almost simultaneously. First, respect for that person begins eroding slowly but surely. It starts to read as though they do not respect themselves enough to protect their own needs, and that is deeply unattractive, even if it cannot always be put into words in the moment. Second, instead of feeling cared for, there is actually an uncomfortable undercurrent of guilt, a sense that the situation could be taken advantage of if someone really wanted to, that the door has been left wide open with no resistance whatsoever. That combination, eroding respect plus creeping guilt, kills attraction fast, almost instantly in some cases. What genuinely draws an avoidant person in, what actually keeps them leaning forward instead of retreating, is someone who gives freely and openly while still firmly protecting their own needs and boundaries. It is generosity that does not erase the self in the process. Generosity that comes from a place of abundance rather than self-sacrifice. That specific tension, someone caring deeply while still clearly valuing themselves, is exactly what keeps an avoidant person engaged over the long term, because it means the relationship cannot simply be dominated or controlled. It forces a healthier dynamic, one where both people meet each other halfway, rather than one side just taking whatever is offered without any real effort in return. Here's a quick story to illustrate this. Years back, a friend of mine had an avoidant partner who loved texting late into the night. She always responded, no matter the hour, even at the cost of sleep. She would wake up drained, and over time, it wore her down into a kind of exhausted autopilot. Eventually, completely worn out, she started going to bed early instead. The shift in him was almost immediate. He began putting real effort into daytime conversations, and he even grew concerned when her usual late-night replies stopped coming. She never intended to set a boundary. It happened by accident. But that is exactly the lesson here. The strongest boundaries are not dramatic ultimatums. They are simply honoring your own needs. By prioritizing her rest, she stopped being endlessly available on demand, and that small shift made her presence feel more valuable. Avoidant people pick up on that instantly. They are not drawn to people who hand over everything unconditionally. They are drawn to care that has real weight behind it, care rooted in self-respect. Which brings us to the third paradox, and honestly, this one might be the trickiest to fully grasp. Stability paired with spontaneity. Avoidant people, myself included, tend to live almost entirely inside our own heads. We plan things out, try to control variables wherever we can, overanalyze conversations, silences, tone, sometimes to an exhausting degree. Stability is what quiets that internal noise. It is the thing that reassures us the world is not about to spin out of control, that the ground beneath us is solid rather than shifting. A dependable partner, someone who consistently follows through on what they say, who does not ambush us with sudden emotional swings, becomes the essential foundation everything else gets built on. Without that foundation, nothing else really has a chance to work. But here's the twist, and it is one that trips a lot of people up. Stability on its own, without anything layered on top of it, eventually starts to feel flat. It becomes too predictable, too safe, and if we are being honest, kind of dull after a while. This ties directly back to that same idea mentioned earlier, that people with insecure attachment styles, whether anxious or avoidant, can actually grow restless when paired with someone who is entirely secure and steady. It sounds almost backwards. You would think total stability would be the dream. But for a nervous system wired around unpredictability, pure calm can start to register as lifeless rather than comforting. So what genuinely holds an avoidant person's interest, speaking from personal experience, is a partner who does two things at once. First, they anchor with real, demonstrated consistency, so there is a clear sense of where things stand and confidence they will show up when they say they will. Second, and just as important, they still find ways to keep things interesting. Maybe it is spontaneity in small doses, an unplanned outing, an unexpected gesture, a shift in routine that keeps things feeling alive. That element of surprise interrupts the overthinking spiral the avoidant brain tends to default to, without ever tipping into territory that feels unsafe or destabilizing. It is a narrow window, admittedly, but when someone hits it, the effect is powerful. Predictable enough to feel secure, unpredictable enough to stay genuinely engaged and curious. That combination, consistency paired with just enough novelty, is really the underlying mechanism behind everything discussed here. And once you see it clearly, you start to realize it was never about chasing extremes in either direction. It is not about being maximally warm or maximally distant, maximally giving or maximally boundaried, maximally stable or maximally chaotic. It is about contradictions that, when balanced correctly, produce something whole. Warmth paired with space, generosity paired with boundaries, stability paired with spontaneity. Three separate tensions, but all following the exact same underlying logic. And this is the part worth really sitting with. Nobody falls for a single isolated trait in another person. Nobody falls for warmth by itself, or independence by itself, or reliability by itself. What actually pulls someone in, what actually creates that magnetic, cannot look away feeling, is the tension that exists between two seemingly opposing traits. It is the push and pull happening simultaneously inside one person that makes them feel dynamic, alive, and safe all at once. Now, here is the part that matters most if you are trying to apply any of this in your own relationships. You cannot fake your way into this dynamic. Avoidant people almost universally have finely tuned radar for anything that feels performative or strategic. They can sense when warmth is being manufactured as a tactic rather than offered genuinely. And the same goes for manufactured mystery or calculated unavailability. So this is not a script to follow or a set of moves to execute. It has to be something authentically built into who you are and how you naturally show up in a relationship. That means learning how to be warm without tipping into smothering someone. It means being generous with your time, attention, and affection without losing your own sense of self in the process. It means being steady and dependable without becoming someone who is simply boring or one-dimensional. That specific paradox, that tension between opposing qualities coexisting in one person, is exactly what we are wired to crave on some deep, often unconscious level, even if most avoidant people would never openly admit that out loud. I am choosing to say it plainly here because I think it matters. So if you have ever found yourself confused or hurt, wondering why an avoidant partner did not fall for you, despite pouring everything you had into the relationship, giving endlessly, being available around the clock, staying consistent no matter what, it might come down to something simple. You may have been offering only one side of the coin, when what actually draws an avoidant person in, what actually disarms their defenses, is experiencing both sides at once. Take that with you. Be patient with yourself as you figure out what balance looks like in your own relationships, and I will see you in the next one.